Welcome back, and in this lesson, we're going to take what we've learned in the previous lessons and build out a safe cracker game. So the objective of this game is to guess all three of these numbers. So typically they wouldn't be displayed to the user. The user would come in and they would have to enter in three random numbers, and they would get returned back that their guess should be higher or that their guess should be lower. And we see by going by this, so we had guess 3, so let's try 5. This one is higher as well, so we'll do 7. And this one is lower, so we'll do 1. And we'll see what the results are. So 1 we got correct, so we've got 5, which matches with this value. And these two are lower, so we know that this one is higher than the 3 that we initially tried. So let's go ahead and try 5. And then the last one is lower still, so lower than 1 is 0. So we see that now we try 550, and we were actually able to guess the code, so we got it correct. So basically, that's the game, and the function gets initiated by the try code. We've got all three of these inputs for all three different numbers, and we've got an output area so that we can see what's happening within the game. So let's start by setting up our initial values for this game. And within this game, we're going to use a combination of local scopes for an array value. So these are going to be the ones that are going to contain the inputs, and we're also going to use a global scope. So for the global scope, we need to initially set up what our code is going to be. So I'm going to give it a blank array, and I'm going to just set that up, create that array. So we're just creating a blank array there called C code. Another value that I need to set up is a count. So I'm going to start this count at 0, and this is the one that is actually going to check to see how many of the items the user got correct, and if they've got all three correct, then we know that they've completed the game and that they've won the game. So next, we also need to set up our object, so our output object. So just as we've done many times before, so this is document get element by ID. Let's add that output in there so that our output variable will contain the output object. And now let's also set up the objects for C1. So that's going to be the code 1 that's being guessed. So get element by ID. And so from here, we're going to have to pick up the values, but we need to pick up the values at the time that the function gets fired off. So for now, we're just going to hold all of those objects, and we're going to grab the values within the function. So if we grab them outside of the function, then we're actually not going to get the value at the time when the function is triggered, and that's what we need. We need to get that value of the time of triggering. So now that we've set up our basic variables, we need to actually build up our set of numbers, and we want to do this randomly so that there is no preset number of numbers. And for this, I'm going to create an array for it. So variable x equals 0, and we're going to loop it while x is less than 3, and we're going to increment x. So making use of loops, which we saw earlier, and we need to actually post random numbers from 0 to 9 within our code array. So this is the one that we created. So what I want you to do now is pause the video, use the code that I've set up, make the same connections here, and ready to go, and add in to the code array, create an array with 3 separate numbers from 0 to 9. And go ahead, pause the video, try that out, and I'll show you the solution. So the solution to add into an array is you do the array name and push, and we need to push a random value. So we're just going to do math floor, and then within here we're going to wrap the math random method. So these are built-in JavaScripts that we've used before, and we want a number from 0 to 9. That's what we're going to multiply it by 9. So that's the solution for there. And at this point, once we loop through there, we can output that as inner HTML. So just what I've done over here, and let's output that so we can actually see the code that gets randomly generated. So let's go back out, refresh the page, and refresh and refresh. So there we go. So we've got a random code. And so as I said, this typically wouldn't be shown to the user. You'd get the user to either guess higher or lower. So now we need to build out our functionality. So we need to set up an array called crack so that the user can actually trigger the cracking of the code with the variables that they have sitting within the object here. So let's go ahead and we're going to set count to 0. So this is going to be our way to tell if the user has guessed the right values. So every time they get a right number, we're going to increment count by 1. So the next thing that I want it to do is I want it to grab all of these guessed numbers, and we're going to actually put them into an array. So set that up and guess. So just give the array a name there. I'm going to call it guess, and we're going to attach it to C1 value, C2 value, and C3 value. And the reason that we need to set this up within the function is otherwise, if we grab the values out here, we're not going to be able to get the current values when the function is actually being triggered. So that's why we need to set it up locally, or we could use an external, a global function, a global array, but then we constantly have to write into that. And since we're not going to be using these guess values outside of the function, the best practice is to keep them locally. So this is the function scope, and of course, once this function finishes executing, all of these local values that are contained only within the function are going to be destroyed. So once the function finishes, we don't really have any use for them because these are expected to be changing. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to loop through these values and compare them to the values that we have in C code. So let's do that. So let's set up another loop here. So we're going to loop through all of the values starting at 0, and we're going to loop through while x is less than, and let's do this dynamically so it's less than the length of C code, and increment x by 1. And then let's write our function code. So what I want to ideally do is actually I want to have another function that's actually going to check the values and return back the values. So let's set this up where we've got output inner HTML. So we're going to update that inner HTML of the output with the guess and returned if it's higher or lower. And let's give this function a name check num and pass a few values. So the first value that we want to pass over is the user's guess. So we'll pass that value. And the other argument that we want it to pass here is we want to pass the actual value that we want to make use of from the array. So let's grab from code or C code, and let's pass that as an argument as well. So now we need to set up the function to pick up these arguments. So go ahead, pause the video, and create a brand new function called check number that's going to take these two arguments in and then compare them to see if one is larger than the other and return back lower or higher. And then also if the number, I guess, is correct, then we're just going to return back that number. So try that out, and I'll show you the solution coming up. So I hope you had the opportunity to try out creating that function. So this is the check number function, and we did say that we needed to pass those two parameters into it because we've got them as arguments over here. So we're just picking those up and passing them in. So there would be no way that this function could know where we are within the loop without us actually passing that information. We create a guess locally, so that guess is only available within the function crack, so it wouldn't be accessible through check number, and that's why we're passing them here within the arguments and picking them up as parameters under check num function. So now we need to do something with those check nums. So let's create our first test, and we'll see if A is larger than B And if it is, then we're going to return back that the number is actually lower. So they've guessed and the actual real value is lower. And one thing to note about arrays, whenever you do a return, then it's going to stop executing the rest of the code. So this is the way to break out of a function that you do a return, and then it's not going to worry about any of the rest of the code. So if this statement is true, then it's simply going to return back L. If it's not true, then we got another shot at it, and this time let's do A is less than B. And this time we're going to return instead of lower. That basically means that the value is actually higher. So we're going to return back an H to the user. And then lastly, we need to set one more up, and that basically, if A is equal to B, then what we're going to return back is we're going to return back the value of A, or we could return back the value of B. So that basically means that they've got the guess right, and we're just going to simply return back the number. There's nothing more that they need to do. There is one other thing that we need to do over here, and besides returning the value, we need to increment the count. And this was our way of telling to check to see if the user, if they've guessed all three correct, and if they have, then we're starting off, when we enter in this function, this is a global value, so our count is 0. So when we run through here, and if we increment count, so basically that means that after we finish this loop, if the value of count is equal to 3, then that means that the user's actually solved the puzzle. So we'll check to see if count is equal to 3. And if it is, then we know that we're outputting in our HTML, and we're just going to say you guessed it. And at that point, the user can pretty much finish the game, and we can add in even more to finish the game up. And if the count is not equal to 3, then we're just going to add in a line break into the output, so that giving the user the ability to guess again. So let's go ahead, refresh our browser and try it out. So the random numbers are 8, 7, 7. So again, this is something that we're going to get rid of for the user, but this is just while we're practicing, just to make sure that everything is running okay. It's always a good idea to actually see the solution. So I'm going to start with 5, 5, 5, and we know that the actual values are higher. So it's higher than 5, higher than 5, and higher than 5. So let's try 7, 7, 7. And we know that the first number is higher, the second number is right, the third number is right. So we know that there's only two numbers that are higher than 7. So there's 8 and 9. So if we try 9, then we know that this number should be lower. So lastly, let's try 8, 7, 7. And we guessed it, so we're correct, and that completes the game. So go ahead, try this out for yourself, and see if you can set this up. And also, let's get rid of that output in our HTML. So when we guess it, the user actually has no idea what the numbers are. So all of these numbers are higher. So now I try 7, 7, 7. And we see that we've got one of them. These ones are lower. So these are 6 and 6. And we're able to guess it within 3 tries. So you can even update this game and count how many tries it took the user to finally guess the number. You can add in an additional number as well, so you can just add in another number here within the code to make it even more difficult. And all of this functionality will work the same way. All you'd have to do is increase the loop values here in order to accommodate that new value. So go ahead, try the code out, and then make some improvements on the code. Add in another number to guess, as well as add in that ability to count how many guesses the user has gone through and how many guesses it took them to finally guess the right answer. So try it out for yourself, and the next lesson we're going to look at more you can do with functions. Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to look at anonymous functions. So anonymous functions are different than named functions. Basically, an anonymous function can sit in a variable, so we'll just call it variable A, And then within this variable a, we're going to have a function, and we're going to actually take a parameter in there. So we're going to take the value of b, and then we're going to do something with the value of b. So we'll set up our output so that we actually have our document object. So document get element by ID, and grab output so that we can output to the inner HTML. So basically what I want to happen within this function is I want to output to the inner HTML. I'm going to say welcome to an anonymous function. And then next to this, we're going to add b. So let me show you what happens. So because this is an anonymous function, we're actually not going to see anything happen in the output, because just like functions, we need to execute them, but they're going to work similar but also differently. So if I select A, I can see that I've got the content of my anonymous function. If I do A with the rounded brackets, we're actually going to see the output, but we get this undefined because it's actually expecting a parameter. So I'm going to type in a parameter there. And now when we do A and we pass the value of test in as an argument into the parameters here, we see welcome to an anonymous function test. And the difference between anonymous functions and named functions is that anonymous functions actually only exist after they've been called by the program to execute it. So this won't actually exist until we call them, whereas the functions can be accessed from anywhere within the program. And the other big difference between an anonymous function being assigned via a variable is that if I take the variable of A and I reassign it, and we know that JavaScript has this dynamic type where we can switch between numbers and strings, but we can also reassign these variables from containing an anonymous function to just having a string value. So now if I do A, I get that string value returned. If I do A with the parentheses, there's no function attached to it anymore. So we've gotten rid of that anonymous function. And the use case for anonymous functions is just that. If you do need to have a more dynamic capability of adding in different changing functions so that they're not all the same, then we can have more flexibility when we're creating our functions by using this type of method with the variables. So now what I want you to do is try this out for yourself and update it and create an anonymous function assigned to a variable, and then call that function and then update the function or update the variable to hold just a regular value. So go ahead, try it out for yourself. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at even more that you can do with anonymous functions. Welcome back. And another use for anonymous functions is to have self-executing functions. So very similar to the anonymous function, it gives us the ability to execute a function whenever the script comes to that. And there is a benefit for this because it does actually give us the ability to execute out and set variables, because as we know, variables will only live inside of the function if they're created within the function and they're declared within the function. So we can make use of variables within that function and output them and utilize them, and then we know that they get destroyed as soon as the function finishes rendering out. So this is how we can create a self-executing function. So basically what's going to happen here is that this function is going to execute out, and let's set up a variable. So we're setting up a variable of A, and this one is going to say hello. And then within here, we're creating another variable A, and this one is going to say world. And basically, we'll output A here, and then let's output the value of a as well afterwards. So after the function gets called, after it runs through, then we're going to also add in the other value of a, and we'll put a space there. Let's try this out, and we get world hello. So basically what's happened here is that I should actually reverse these because we know that we're trying to call to this one first and that one second. So more typically you would see hello world. So let's go through what's going on here within the code. And self-executing anonymous functions, they're great for holding items, variables specifically that you might not need to make use of after you've done this initiation of them. So you don't need to hold them in the memory any longer, and basically you can get them destroyed after it exits and executes. And this is a great way to, especially if you've got a really long program and you've got a lot of variables that you're using, to make sure that you're not having conflicting values for the variables. You use them when you need to make use of them, and then once you've completed and once you've run through your use of them, then you can go back to the global variables and then also make use of those. So it's a way to save some space within the memory. So basically we're setting the value of a over here. We're grabbing that element, that area, to output our content. Then we're creating this anonymous function, so no name for the function, because we don't need to make use of it anywhere else within our script. We just want it to run through one time. And ideally it's going to hold a bunch of variables here that we're going to do something with. We're going to make use of them. We might also make use of some of the global variables. We can't call them the same, obviously, but we can make use of some global variables, some local variables, create an output, and then once that finishes running, all of those variables get destroyed, and we go back to our global scope where we've just outputting the initial value that we had within our global scope. So that's what's happening there, and when we refresh it and output it, we get hello world. So what I want you to do is try this out for yourself as well, and try creating an anonymous function to run and set up some variables in there, and then output those variables, do something with the variables within that anonymous function, and then once you've finished, then you can go back and start using some of the global variables that you had originally set up outside of this anonymous function. So go ahead, open up your editor, try it out for yourself. Welcome back, and with functions you can actually call a function, so you can call a function within itself. So basically that technique is called recursion. So I'm going to show you an example of that. So we're going to take what we did earlier where we had a secret word and we're outputting some content into our elements here. So let's create a function. So I've already created one for on-click event where we're going to launch start. So basically this function is going to start our whole process where we're going to be prompting and we're going to get a secret. So let's set up a function in order to test our response here that we're going to get from the prompt. So we're going to test the value of the prompt to see if it's equal to the secret word, and then within the function, so directly, we're going to prompt and ask the user for what is the word and question mark. And then down here, we need to create one more function that's going to actually check and get the secret word. So we're passing in a parameter, so let's call this secret. And we need to have a conditional statement. So that conditional statement has to check to see if we've got the word correct. So we're passing it in as a value here called secret, and we need to compare it to see if it's equal to what our secret word is. So let's set up that condition in order to do that. So we're going to compare secret to see if it's equal to secret word. And if it is, then we know that we've got it correct, and we're going to output to the inner HTML, and we're going to say you are correct. Otherwise, so there's an else to this. We basically want to initiate the prompt again and get the user to be asked the same question. So we have a choice here. We can just do start, and then that will go to that function, and that will launch our function that we're already in. Or we could go directly with the function that's within start, and this is getSecret within getSecret. And now maybe let's update this to say guess again. And now let's try this out. So start the game. What is the word? So this time let me enter in Java. And now it says guess a game, so JavaScript. And guess again because it's case sensitive. We've got to make sure that it's correct. So there we go. So it says you are correct. So if we want to start again, then there we go. We can try to guess the correct word once again. So what I want you to do now is pause the video and update the script to have an array of possible words. Pick a word out from the array randomly, and so that way the script can be dynamic and have a selection of words that could be the secret word, and then let the user try a bunch of different words and keeping the recursion in there so we're calling back to the function within itself. So the only thing that would be different is when we initially start the game, we're going to be adding in the ability to pick a random word using from our array within start. So go ahead and try that out, and I will show you the solution coming up. So the solution is to transform this into an array. So we know that we can do that by updating, and let's have a number of different possibilities in here. So CSS, JavaScript, and HTML, and website or something like that. So it doesn't really matter. We've got 4 words in there that we can make use of. So what we want to do is when the user hits start, that's where we want to pick the word that's going to be the secret word. And we need to pick actually a random value here. So let's set up this, and we'll say mystery number. And this one right now, we're just going to declare the variable. And then within here, whenever we start, this is where we're going to reset that mystery number, and we need to use the math. So this is built into JavaScript. Gives us the ability to make random numbers. So random, so using math, random, and we want to multiply it by, we've got an array here, and we want to do secret word length. So this will actually give us a value of within the secret word length. And so when we go to check it, all we need to do is add that in. So we're actually not going to know what the word is. So let's save this, refresh it. And I believe I have to cancel out of this to refresh it. So let's refresh the game and try this again. So what is the word? Let's try JavaScript. And it's not JavaScript. Let's try HTML. It's not HTML. Let's try CSS. It's not CSS. So let's try website. So that time it was website, and we have the ability to play the game again. So that game was so much fun that we're going to just continue to try it. And this time, let's see what the word is. So this time it was JavaScript. So this one was, again, the last guess that I made. So you can play the game multiple times, and you can, it's dynamic. So if you add in more words into the array, then the script will adjust accordingly. So again, the last one that I tried. So have some fun with this. Create some nice, interesting secret words. Try the game out for yourself, and make sure that you get used to using the recursion. So basically that's calling the function within itself. And this is really useful in place of a loop. So typically you might have the conditional statement here, and then you've got the prompt again. So this is a better way of doing that, where you simply call back to that statement until you actually get the result that you want, and then you continue to loop through that function until you actually get the correct result. So that's one of the benefits of doing it this way. And it's important to keep in mind that this actually, it won't break out of here until we've actually hit the right value. So it'll continue to have these prompts until the right value is set up. So just like when you have loops, you always got to think that there should really be a way out of it, and always having a way out of your function is something that you should include as well and keep in mind. Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to build out a really useful function, and this could be one of the functions that you keep within your library of functions because it's super useful within JavaScript. And this is the ability to shuffle your items within the array. So we've got an array here, and this is the same one that we used previously, and what I actually want to do is I want to shuffle the array. So I want to build out a function, and I'm going to have that start function, and basically what the start function is going to do, it's going to call out to shuffle the array. So we're going to create another function to shuffle the array, and I also want to pass in those array values so that we can shuffle those as well. So let's shuffle the array, and the array that we're shuffling is secret word. And then what we want to do is I want to output it. So again, we need to set up that output. So output equals document get element by ID, and let's grab that output element into our object, and every time we shuffle, let's output what our array looks like. So we'll output our array, and the order should actually change. So let's now set up the function in order to shuffle array, and we're taking that one parameter, which is going to be the array, and we're passing that in, and then here is where all the magic is going to happen. And once I finish shuffling the array, let's return that new array value. So right now, whenever we refresh it, we're going to just simply get that output. And I should put a line break in there so it's more readable. So let's try that again. So now every time I click it, we still get that same array order. So the idea here is that we want to take that array order and we want to shuffle it around. And this is going to be a really useful function when it comes to arrays. So I use it quite often when I'm working with arrays, and I use this function to shuffle the values within the arrays. So we need to create a loop. So let's create a loop starting out, give it a value of x, and we're going to give it a value of whatever the length of the array is that's passed in. So this is what makes it dynamic. We also have to subtract 1 because we know that arrays start at 0. So I want to make sure that I'm able to count down all the way to 0. So let's do array minus 1. And we're going to loop while x is larger than 0, and we're going to decrease the value of x by 1 through every iteration of the loop. So we know that we're picking up that this array, the secret word array, is being passed in here. We're passing it in to this function as a parameter here. So this argument is being passed in as a parameter, and we're able to make use of it within our array. So now we need to set up a variable, and this variable is going to be the holding value. So I usually just call it holder, and we'll do the math floor, and this is similar to what we just did previously, where we get a random value for the items in the array. So this time we know that we have all of the values within the array under x, and we're going to do x plus 1. So this is going to give us one of the items that are in the array, and as we decrease, the number of items that are left within this random formula are going to change as well. So there's going to be a possibility to take several items and just swap them randomly. So basically that's what we're doing, and as we loop through the array, we're going to select out different items and swap positions. So the holder is just selecting a random item from the array. that's available. And next, we need to set up a temp. So this is going to be our temp value from the array. So all we need to do is set up and use X here. So now what we're holding is, so as we loop through the array, we're going to decrease the value of X. So we're going to start out with the highest value. So we're going to take website. We're also doing a random value of X here. So we could have any one of these within this loop as well. So we're taking the value for website. We're holding it temporarily. And next, we're reassigning the value from website, and we're going to use another item from the array. So this time we're going to use this random item here within the array. So basically we're swapping, but we're not including this one in the swap. So we can't swap it with itself essentially. So doing that, we pick up random item that we're holding from math here. And then lastly, let's swap our holder value. So this is the random one, and we're swapping it with the value we had initially held in temp. So that's it. So basically what's going to happen here is as we loop through, these array items are going to swap places. So let's refresh it and try this out. So we see that basically we're able to generate random array listing, so reindex the array and have it randomly displayed. And this works really well if I add in more values, and I'm going to do some numeric ones because they're just easier to add in. So we'll refresh it, and you can see that because it's dynamic, it works with any number of items within the array, and then also we can utilize this with any array essentially. That's why I said that this is a great function to have, and you'll find that as you're developing, this is where functions become really useful, because you'll develop these nice, neat functions that are fully dynamic, and you can utilize them in any number of projects. So when you're coding out and you need something to shuffle an array, you can default to one of these ones that you've built. So go ahead, open up your editor, create an array, and create the shuffle array function. So try it out for yourself and check it out and try it out and see how it works within your editor, within your browser. Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to look at function scope. So function scope is how variables are treated, so global variables and local variables, and how they get treated with being inside of a function or outside of a function when we declare a variable. So let's go ahead and create a variable. So we'll just call it outside fun, and we're going to give it a value of outside. So this is a variable that we're creating, and this is going to be a global variable, basically meaning that we can access it within our functions and outside of our functions, as long as we're not redeclaring it locally within our function. So next thing we're going to do, set up a function, and I'm going to create another variable, and this time I'm going to declare a variable called inside fun, and give it a value of inside. So now we've got a variable that's only accessible locally within the function myFun. So basically that also means that I can't access that same variable out inside of another function. So let's take a closer look and see how this works. So if I console log inside of the function, I can access outside fun, so I can access the variable outside fun, and also if I console log inside fun, I'll get a value for that as well. And so let's call our function, and let me show you what happens when I try to access the inside fun outside of the function scope. So let's sort both of those up, save it, refresh it, and let's open up our console. So we see that within the console where we've got that first variable, that outside, we see, because these two are being output in the console from within the function, so we do have access to the inside variable, but when we try to access it outside of the function, we no longer have access to it. So there's one thing that I did want to show you within this lesson is that if you declare a variable, but you don't use the var to declare the variable, watch what happens to this inside fun variable. So when we refresh it, and let's open that up within the console again, and we see that we actually do have access to it. And remember, this console log statement is actually sitting outside of the function. So what happened here, where we've got the actual coding that's actually sitting inside of the function, we're declaring it, and yet we're still able to access it outside of the function. So this is one of those quirks in regards to JavaScript where it tries to fix an error, and it sees that you're trying to call a variable called inside fun, and it doesn't actually see that within the global scope, but it does see that because the function has been initiated, it's been run, and it knows that there's been a variable that's been declared within the function. It's called inside fun. Another thing too, that following the rules of JavaScript, it also knows that when you're trying to access a variable, that you would typically expect it that it's already declared outside unless you're declaring it here. So this is why by default it will go out to the global scope and it will be accessible outside of the function. And I'm just showing you this because this is a common error and a common mistake that's made when you're writing JavaScript, that if you're setting up variables and you set them up and you don't declare them properly, then they actually become global variables, and you can have issues and errors in regards to this. And in general, if we're not using any variables across multiple functions, then we try not to actually declare them globally unless it's actually absolutely necessary. And this would be a really bad way to set up global variables because it is reliant on the function running. So if I do comment out the function, I go back out, refresh the page, and I take a look in the console, we see that inside fun is not defined. So it knows that that variable has not yet been defined, but yet I'm trying to access it. So it is dependent on running the function in order to have access to that variable, and this is something that you want to avoid just for that reason alone, because having to set it up within a function just does not work well. So what I want you to do now is set up a variable. So have one variable on the outside and set up another variable that you're actually declaring on the inside part of the function, and then output them both within the function and try it out for yourself just to get really familiar with how function scope works and get yourself familiar with setting up global variables as well as local variables within functions, because it's going to be a very important part of using JavaScript. And I'm going to get rid of this statement here because this isn't correct, as we wouldn't be calling a function that would have been locally defined within fun. So go ahead, try it out yourself, and just get used to working with local and global variables.